Now, the Labour leader Keir Starmer has been repeatedly challenging Boris Johnson over number 10 parties in the Commons this week. The Prime Minister accused Sir Keir of being stuck in a time warp. He joins me now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is more important to the country right now? Parties, lockdown parties, or the cost of living?
For millions of people across the country, it's the cost of living. What they've seen is their energy bills going up just a few weeks ago, and this month they get increased taxes in national insurance. And because local elections are on across the whole United Kingdom, I'm spending the whole of my time, when I don't have to be in Parliament, across the country, and that is the single #1 issue for so many people, and they're really struggling to pay their bills, and the response of the government in the spring statement was woeful. They've made a bad situation worse. They've chosen to add additional taxes, you know, the wrong tax at the wrong time. And in addition to that, they're not even chasing some of the losses in fraud, and £11.8 billion worth has been lost, and they're not chasing that. So for many people, it's the cost of living.
So given all that, why did you spend all of last week talking about lockdown parties and the fine that the Prime Minister has been received? Because
the Prime Minister got a fine. We only had a statement on Tuesday in the House of Commons from the Prime Minister because he received a fine. I didn't initiate that statement. I was glad he made it. But I want to talk about the cost of living crisis because I think the situation is... I've spoken just in the last week or two to a pensioner with mobility problems who told me that she daren't even put the central heating on anymore. She's so worried about the bills. And the government's response has been utterly woeful. They did nothing in the spring statement for millions of people.
If you want to talk about
They're now increasing tax on them. I think we need an emergency budget, and I'm calling on the government for an emergency budget.
Why didn't you talk about all that last week? I mean, that's why I'm asking, because last week, it was Tuesday, you talked about the Prime Minister about parties. Prime Minister's questions, you had the chance to talk to him again. It was all about parties. Thursday, you were up in Parliament again. It was all about parties. Why are you not talking about that? Why are you focusing relentlessly on parties?
Well, I want to talk about the cost of living, and I'm very happy to talk about the cost of living. Yeah. Well, as I say, why were we in Parliament on Tuesday with the Prime Minister? Because he got a crime. He got a fine. I do want to concentrate on the cost of living, but if you or anybody else think that I'm not bothered by standards in public life, that it doesn't matter that the Prime Minister has broken the laws that he made, that it doesn't matter that his authority to lead the country is shot through, that it doesn't matter that his own MPs now, as we saw on Thursday, don't really want to defend him because they're sick of defending the indefensible, then I'm sorry, I'm not going to shy away from that. But yeah, this morning, what we're calling for is an emergency budget to deal with the cost of living crisis. And I'm very happy to tell you what I think should be in that budget, because for millions of people, this is a real struggle as they see practically all their bills going up, their wages are not going up, and this month they're being caned with further tax from this government.
There are people who have really had enough of talking about parties and hearing you talking about parties and politicians talking about parties. There are also people who will be watching this and thinking that some of these fines are a bit excessive, like the Chancellor, for example. He walked into that cabinet room, didn't he? June 2020, he was expecting to go to a meeting. He found people in there celebrating the Prime Minister's birthday. It was an event he hadn't planned. It lasted a few minutes. He didn't drink any alcohol. You will remember, you and I talked about a photograph of you in Durham when you were drinking beer at a constituency during a constituency meeting in Durham. That was at a time when those sort of gatherings were not allowed under the law. Do you think that it's that different?
Well, I don't know the details of what the Chancellor was up to. I don't know what he said in his questionnaire in response to the police. So I'm not in a position to comment on that. I do know that over 50 fines have been issued in relation to what went on in Downing Street. That is extraordinary. It's probably the most fined workplace in the whole of the United Kingdom. And we're not at the end of these fines yet. But I'm sorry, on this question, because a number of people have challenged me on this, said, look, here, you know, what's the difference between this and a speeding fine? You know, get everything in proportion. And I tell you, in all my days, nobody has ever broken down in front of me in tears because they couldn't go 35 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. People have broken down in front of me in tears because they couldn't do what they wanted to do because of the rules. But no, just let me finish this point, because It's the raw human emotion is the reason I think so many people feel so strongly about this. You know, people missed funerals, they missed marriages, they missed the birth of their own children. But every family, in addition to that, had something that they didn't do. Usually visiting an elderly relative.
Absolutely. But
so just pretending that it doesn't really matter when millions of people made a sacrifice.
But I'm just asking you about the comparison between the Chancellor and the fine that he got and the time when you were in Durham, you were drinking beer. It was during the local elections. You stopped, you were working briefly, you had food and beer with colleagues, which actually under the law at the time wasn't really permitted. And I'm just wondering whether it is, you feel lucky that you didn't get a fine.
Sophie, I don't accept that. I think last time I was on your programme, or the one before, you put the same question to me seven times on this, so we did it pretty extensively.
I'm not sure about 7, but yes.
Well, whatever. The police looked into it. That's the end of it. I've got nothing to add. There's no equivalence. There's no way of suggesting that 50 fines in Downing Street, the Prime Minister
I'm just talking one specific one for the Chancellor, not 50.
They have been found to have broken the law, the criminal law at that. No other Prime Minister in the history of our country has ever been found to have broken the law in office before. And I don't think we can just pass over it. It also means that he's coming to the House of Commons to make statements about Partygate when he should be coming to make statements about the cost of living. I would rather the Prime Minister brought forward, or the Chancellor brought forward, an emergency budget, because for millions of people struggling to pay their bills, what they want is more action from the Prime Minister and from the Chancellor on this. I'm desperate to persuade the government to have a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea to reduce people's bills by up to £600. That's one of our proposals. I want to have that discussion with the government. I want that to be what we're talking about in Parliament.
At the beginning was you could have been doing that last week. You did have 3 occasions in Parliament when you could have been talking about that, and you chose to concentrate on lockdown parties. Can I also talk...
That's just wrong. I mean, the statement on Tuesday was...
Prime Minister's questions.
Well, you know, we made... Why, I don't think anybody could accuse me of not concentrating on the cost of living in PMQs in the last month after month after month. But why are we talking about this? Answer, because the Prime Minister has broken the rules he made and been fined by the police for doing it. No Prime Minister in the history of our country has ever been in that position before. So he's brought this on himself. His moral authority, his authority to lead is shot through, and his own side have now had enough of defending him.
Let's talk about Rwanda. The Archbishop of Canterbury said that the plan to send some asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda goes against the nature of God. Do you agree?
Well, when you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury and Theresa May telling you your plans are wrong, then I think the government should stop and think again. But let me be
Are they
clear.
Wrong morally?
Look, I don't think these plans will work. I think they're going to cost a fortune. We've seen in the past that similar plans don't work. And I think the Archbishop of Canterbury and Theresa May are absolutely right to criticise them. But what I will say is this. I don't want to see anybody making that perilous journey across the Channel. I do want action that stops that, of course I do. I also want to come down very, very hard on the criminal gangs that are perpetrating
I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but what I just want to clarify, because Yvette Cooper said it was unethical, do you think it is morally wrong what the government is suggesting?
Well, I do think it's unethical, but I also think it's unworkable. I think it's going to cost a fortune. I also can't help feeling, I'm afraid, that there's a bit of distraction tactics in this to stop everybody talking about the wrongdoing of the Prime Minister and the cost of living crisis. But it is important, I think, for me to say this, because when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I was involved in international operations to deal with people trafficking and to deal with the running of drugs and guns. So I know how these operations work. I want those gangs brought down. They're only going to be brought down by international operations where we cooperate across the world at every point along the journey, from where desperate families get hooked up with these criminal gangs that then exploit them all the way through the journey until they get to the north coast of France. And that's the action I want to see the government taking.
And you've talked about getting more safe and legal routes so that people can come here. But I don't understand how that actually works. If, for example, you have a man from Vietnam who has travelled all the way to Calais, he wants to come over, he's planning to come over in a boat. You don't want them to come over in small boats, it risks their lives. What does he do? How does he get this safe and legal route?
Well, I've been in those camps on the north coast of France. and seen the desperate situation that people are in. I've seen children, the same age as my children, in tents in those camps in the most awful circumstances.
What do they do?
What I would like to see, in addition to the international operations to take these gangs down, which I do think is the #1 priority, what I'd also like to see is more support in those camps so that people understand where they do have rights to go to other countries or to apply in France or somewhere else. Because what you see in those camps is the human misery of people who are tied to criminal gangs, and they need the support to help them go through safe and legal routes.
I'm just really interested in the practical solution, though. Are you talking about having centres in Europe where people can go and apply to get the safe and legal route?
Of course you could do that, of course.
Where?
Well, you could do it along the route, but the best place would be the nearest place to the country that they're fleeing from. I mean, but we have set up schemes for Ukraine. We've set up schemes for Afghanistan. I admit the government was behind the curve here and did it in the heat of the moment too slow. But I'm sorry, I don't accept the proposition that it's simply not possible to have a better system than the one that we've got. We also know that the time it takes to process asylum claims in this country now has gone through the floor. We're doing, I think, only 50% of the cases we did 5 years ago. It's taking forever. So there are plenty of things that we could do. For my part, I would start with those international operations to crack down on these criminal gangs. I've seen how that works.
But until
I
there's
know
an
how
option,
that works.
until there is a clear plan and a clear idea of how a safe and legal route would work, where people would have to go, how they would apply, it's not going to deter people from coming to the coast, is it?
Well, what will deter people, what will deal with this situation is cracking down on those criminal gangs, because they're taking money to exploit people on very dangerous routes across the world where people are very often fleeing for various reasons from their country of origin. You have to, if the Home Secretary came up with a strong plan to crack down on these gangs across the world, then we would support it.
Can I ask you about Jeremy Corbyn? He did an interview this week. While he was Labour leader, he said NATO should reduce its presence along Russia's borders. He said that he couldn't say if he would come to the aid of a NATO ally if it was attacked by President Putin. What does it say about your judgment that you campaigned to make him leader, for him to become the next Prime Minister?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the position of Jeremy Corbyn on NATO and my position are very, very different. I went to Brussels just the other week to see the Secretary-General of NATO to talk about the situation in Ukraine and to make absolutely clear the Labour Party's unshakable support for NATO. Labour was, of course, Ernest Bevin, the Labour Minister, was the politician who signed the treaty for NATO on behalf of the United Kingdom. So I've been very, very clear where the Labour Party under my leadership stands.
As has Jeremy Corbyn on his attitude to NATO.
When Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, we maintained a pro-NATO position, not least because of those of us in the party arguing for that position. So the Labour Party position never changed on NATO. It's been a very important part of our defence and our security for many, many years. We were there at the start when NATO was set up, and we're there very strongly now.
Given his views now, do you look back and think that you were wrong to campaign for him in the way that you did?
I think I was right to argue through those years and in the 2 years or so that I've been leader about the importance of NATO.
I'm talking about him.
Well, we as a party never shifted our position on NATO.
But
and that's
wrong
because
to campaign for him, given the views that he held?
Well, the Labour Party position at the last election was pro-NATO, as it was the election before and the election before that. And I don't think I could myself be clearer than I have been about our support for NATO.
Will he ever be a Labour MP again?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to see how that situation can now be resolved. He lost the whip because of his response to the Equality and Human Rights Commission in relation to anti-Semitism. I made it very clear. First thing I said as Labour Party leader, that I was going to tear out anti-Semitism by its roots in our party. I've also made it clear that our position in the Labour Party is not to accept the false equivalence between, you know, Russian aggression and the acts of NATO.
So that's basically a no. He will not be a Labour MP again.
Well, I'm very clear on my positions on those two issues. Very, very clear.
Sir Keir Starmer, thank you very much.
Thank you.